So my name is Lars Rensmann. I'm a professor of political science and comparative government at the University of Passau in Germany. And we are part of this project as we are working on a work package on trying to understand the cleavage structures and the readjustments of political conflict in democracies in Europe, particularly in view of the COVID pandemic and how far the COVID pandemic has somehow transformed and readjusted political conflict in our contemporary societies. That's a good question. And I think there's a lot of transnational variation. In some cases, such as the Italian case, it wasn't really a boost for populism. In other cases, populist parties have tried to capitalize and mobilize around the issue and actually could strengthen their base. In some cases, there was actually a positive electoral turnout when we think of the Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands, which really was a party in shambles by the end of short before the new election cycle, and then the party decided to make COVID-19 in the midst of the crisis the single issue for their campaign, and they succeeded in quadrupling their turnout and gaining 8 seats in the Dutch parliament. So we see a lot of variation. Overall, populists, particularly right-wing populists, try to capitalize and mobilize on the issue, but the success of that is varied. Well, COVID was an issue, really, or a crisis that affected all of society. So everyone had to say something about it. Different from other crises, the COVID-19 time of that period put this issue so much center stage that everything was affected and everyone talked about it. So in a sense, of course, you have a joint conversation all over Europe, all over the world on this issue. But unfortunately, in times of social media and social networks and the times of alternative media and disinformation, to some extent, that conversation, which could have been a good moment overall for public deliberation, for public debate about the best policy, about how we judge and implement certain values in light of a public health crisis, how do we weigh issues of freedom, democracy, and public health, and what means do we implement. Unfortunately, this debate has suffered to some extent. It has suffered from polarization and disinformation, and that made it to some extent, also a difficult moment. So I think like most of our European societies could have handled it differently, better, this type of conversation, this type of public debate, if we would be at a stage in our societies to find a way to cope with disinformation. It did show that, particularly when it comes to public health and the infrastructure of public health, many countries and also Europe as a whole is structurally underfunded. So there's a warning sign that actually we have to invest more in science, we have to invest more in the public health infrastructures, and that is needed. And it's very difficult for national governments right now to cut on healthcare and healthcare provisions. So that is a lesson definitely to be learned. But I think overall democracies went out of this, despite of a lot of talk about potential and the actual infringements on freedoms. Democracies handled the crisis quite well and came out of it largely undamaged. The problem is that COVID-19 put a lot of issues and crises on the table which actually have not been resolved in the long run. So, for example, there was a lot of talk about we need to change the tourism sector, tourism industry. That hasn't happened. We have to think about how we deal with this in terms of the climate crisis. That hasn't happened. We need to think about how we actually fund public infrastructure. That hasn't really happened. So a lot of issues and crises are there to come if we don't basically take that lesson, that we start a new public conversation of what kind of public needs and what kind of democracy we want in the future.